So hi everyone, and welcome to another session of Dhamma Threads, where we are going to be discussing with some friends about the Sammaditthi Sutta, the discourse on right view, Majjhima Nikaya number 9. And we're reading from Bhikkhu Bodhi's English translation. So for the last several sessions we've been looking at this discourse. It looks at the question of right view as discussed by Venerable Sariputta, talking with a group of monks. And we've looked at a variety of topics that it discusses, the wholesome and the unwholesome, the Four Noble Truths and so on, and particularly the various factors of dependent origination. And so these have been discussed in reverse order from aging and death back to ignorance. And in our last session we looked at name and form, or nama rupa, or mentality and materiality, as is translated in this particular volume. And one of the features of the Buddha's teachings, and we find especially in the context of dependent origination, is that name and form, or namarupa, is said to be interdependent with consciousness, or vijnana. These two things are very closely related. So for this current session, we're going to be looking at vijnana, at what's translated here as consciousness. Saying, "Good friend, the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Sariputta's words." And they asked him a further question, "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands consciousness, that's vijnana, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, and the way leading to the cessation of consciousness, in that way he is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma. And what is consciousness? What is the origin of consciousness? What is the cessation of consciousness? What is the way leading to the cessation of consciousness? There are these 6 classes of consciousness: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness. With the arising of sankharas, Bhikkhu Bodhi here is translating it as formations. In his later translation he uses what's probably a better translation is volitional activities. With the arising of volitional activities there is the arising of consciousness. With the cessation of volitional activities there is the cessation of consciousness. The way leading to the cessation of consciousness is just this noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi. When a noble disciple has thus understood consciousness, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, and the way leading to the cessation of consciousness, he entirely abandons the underlying tendency to lust, he abolishes the underlying tendency to aversion, he extirpates the underlying tendency to the view and conceit "I am," and by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way too, a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has unwavering confidence in the Dhamma, and has arrived at this true Dhamma. Okay, so this is this analysis of consciousness we see in terms of the 6 kinds of consciousness. And it's a similar analysis that we've seen throughout the teachings on dependent origination, where the feeling, the craving, and so on are all analysed in terms of this 6-fold senses. Okay, so that's not telling us a huge amount about what consciousness is, or what vijnana is. So we're going to need to do a bit of reflection and so on to clarify what's actually going on here. When the Buddha elsewhere defines consciousness, he defines it, he has this way of defining things, defining a noun by a verb. Okay? So vijadati iti vijnana, it cognizes, therefore it's cognizance. Yeah? Which is very interesting, right? You're turning a thing into a process. You're turning an entity into an activity, a noun into a verb. But of course, consciousness doesn't have a verb. Yeah, it's only a noun form. So perhaps cognizance might be a better word, but hard to say. But it's not particularly common in English. Anyway, we don't need to figure out the translation so much as to try to figure out what the word vijnana meant. So just like with Namarupa, vijnana has its history, and the Buddhist usage is very closely informed by this history. I have to understand that when I say this, I'm not just sort of asserting this, but there are multiple texts and passages that quite clearly show how closely dependent these particular contexts are to what was happening in the Brahmanical tradition at the time. One example of that being the Solasa Panha, which is the important part of the Parayanavagga in the Sutta Nipata, being a discussion between the Buddha and 16 Brahmins. And they come and ask him various questions. And one of the sets of questions that they ask him about is precisely this question of vijnana and namarupa. And so that's showing that not only was this terminology present in the Brahmanical traditions, but it was part of the discussion between the Buddha and the Brahmanical traditions. And he was responding to the usage in that tradition. So if we don't understand what they meant by it, then we can't understand what the Buddha's response was. So what did they actually mean? I already mentioned in the last session that we have this kind of image from the Upanishads of like these rivers, each river having its name and form, right? Its name and its shape. The individual rivers, their individual shapes, their individual names, all going and dissolving into that great ocean, which is the vijnana, the vijnana ghanameva. And so this is kind of an emerging idea or notion of what consciousness was, or what vijnana was. In the Upanishads, that is the pre-Buddhist Brahmanical texts, we don't find any sort of consistent and clearly defined psychology like we find in the Buddhist texts. Okay, for example, you think about, say, something as simple like the six senses, as we've seen here: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, and so on. It's always in the Buddhist text. Every time you find that, it's always the same, right? It's always those six senses, and it's nothing else. Yeah? And it's rigorously consistent. Whereas in the Brahmanical text, it's not like that. Sometimes they'll be in different order. Sometimes some will be left out. Sometimes it'll be mixed up with other kinds of things. So there's not the same sort of level of conceptual clarity and consistency that we find in the Buddhist text. So it's a bit hard to figure out exactly what the theory of mind is that's operating. It's kind of variable and it's a bit ambiguous and so on. But what we do know is that the word vijnana, the older usage or more simple usage, is just like a word for knowledge or to know something. It is used in a more pregnant sense of being something like to understand. Okay, so we still find that in Buddhist, especially in verses, and often verses preserve more archaic meanings of things. So in that sense, vijanati in verses has the same meaning as bhajanati, which is a word from panya, or to understand. Yeah. So to vijanati something is to understand it. So that's one meaning. But through the Upanishads, then you're getting this much more pregnant philosophical meaning. It's the sheer awareness. It's the awareness that's left over when everything else is gone. Yeah? And you're starting to get this very reflective and very quite profound insight into what is the knower. And this is particularly was an innovation and a direction which arose in the Upanishadic tradition from a particular philosopher called Yajnavalkya, who lived in Mithila about 200 years before the Buddha or so. And Yajnavalkya was very famous for a number of sayings, but one of his sayings he was famous for was, it's the unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unthought thinker, the unknown knower. Yeah? That is yourself. Yeah? And another phrase, Yajnavalkya's most famous phrase, neti, neti. Yeah? Not that, not that. Yeah? So think about that in the context of what we're talking about with Namarupa and Vijnana. Right? What does neti, neti mean? Neti, neti means all of those namas and rupas, which are all the things that we know. Right? All the names that we know. Our family, our things, our possessions, all the things we've experienced, all the things that are out there, neti, neti, it's not that. Yeah? What's left over when all of those things have gone? Yeah? And that, again, according to Yajnavalkya's philosophy, that is yourself, and that is that sheer mass of consciousness. Yeah? So this is a very powerful philosophy, a very profound philosophy which emerged in the time before the Buddha, which had come right back to this thing of the knower and the self. Now, one of the reasons why this is so, I think, so profound is because exactly that point that Yajnavalkya was making, it's the unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unthought thinker, the unknown knower. How do you know the knower of all things? Yeah? And so this is that question which he was raising. And it is a very good question, right? Because it's so elusive. And when it's so easy to get distracted into all of the objects, all of the things outside there, all of the things we can know, and to lose sight of the knowing. In fact, it's so elusive that it's virtually escaped the attention of the entire history of Western philosophy and psychology, right down to the present day. And if you look in even contemporary theories of mind and consciousness within Western psychology, right, they almost always just sort of completely miss the point of what actually awareness is. And they end up talking about thought and ideas and awareness and all of these kinds of things, and actually missing what is that spark that is the knowing. Yeah? Now, because every thing that we're aware of, okay, every sight, every sound, every smell, every taste, every touch, every thought, they're all different, right? Sights change, sounds change, thoughts change, all of those things. But there's something that they have in common, and that is that there's an awareness. Yeah? We are aware of all of those things. Yeah? And so this is why the vijnana has such a strong tendency to appear as permanent. It's always there. Everything we know, there's always the vijnana there. And we can't know the unknowing, right? This is why you can't know when you fall asleep, right? It's the knowing is switching off, or at least going to a very subliminal level. How are you actually aware of that? This is why, again, in the Upanishadic philosophy, sleep and dreaming became a huge topic, because it became this question of what is actually, how are you aware at that time? What does awareness mean at the time when you're asleep? So, if this knowing, this spark of awareness is present every time we are aware, how are we to understand it? What are the implications of it? What does it mean? So the Brahmanical tradition came to this conclusion that this is a permanent essence. This is Yajnavalkya's philosophy. And in that tradition, the etymology of the word was defined, the V in vijnana, okay, is said to mean infinite. Okay, so vijnana literally means infinite consciousness or infinite awareness, according to that tradition. Okay, so with that understanding behind us, then we come and we turn to the Buddhist text. How did the Buddha approach this? Well, he said, well, there are these 6 kinds of vijnana: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness. What's he doing here? Well, it's a reductive analysis, right? He's saying this thing which you're taking as being a unity, which you're taking as being infinite, in fact, you can look at it as these discrete events of consciousness, this discrete process, which is actually all different. Sometimes it's seeing, sometimes it's hearing, and these things are completely different kinds of things. Yeah? They're similar in that they're aware, but what they're aware of, the nature of it, is quite different. And so so this analysis, the whole purpose of this is why consciousness here is broken down into these 6 things. Even though it seems like it's kind of a bit of a dry or meaningless analysis, that's the point. The point is to say it's not a unitary thing. It is, in fact, these 6 kinds of things which we can then start to relate to our experience. Yeah? So then it's when you can turn to meditation and you can start to investigate. And in meditation, because essentially what happens in meditation basically is that the nama rupa becomes subtle. Okay? Thoughts tend to fade away, sounds and distractions tend to lessen, everything becomes more subtle and more transparent. Yeah? And the more subtle and the more transparent these nama rupa becomes, the more you can see the mind, the awareness reflected in that. Yeah? And so this is what you see especially when you come into deep meditation and you start to see like the lights, what they call the nimitta. Yeah? In the suttas it talks about the obhasa or the pabhasara or the the rupana dasanang, the vision of forms in meditation. And so this is when the meditation becomes deep, the lights appear in the mind. Yeah? So what is the light? The light, of course, is nothing other than vijnana. Yeah? And this is now being reflected. Yeah? The mind's becoming transparent. Kind of the mists are fading, the veils are falling away, and that nama rupa, right? The feelings and perceptions and so on, is now reflecting the consciousness in a much more transparent way. So that's how you know, that's how you answer Yajnavalkya's question. How do you see the unseen seer, the unknown knower, the unthought thinker, the unknown knower? Yeah? That's through deep meditation. You gradually come to an apprehension of what this thing vijnana actually is. Consciousness is transferred is a slightly clumsy idiom, but it's not easy to find good idioms. I mean, the phrases that the Buddha used for that were the vijnana sota in one place, the stream of consciousness. Yeah? So he talks about a stream of consciousness which is established in this world and established in the next world. Yeah, another phrase that's used in the same context is the sangvatdanika vijnana, the on-flowing consciousness. It is important to recognize also one of the problems with using the word consciousness is that in English and in a Western context, it has nothing to do with rebirth. Right? Consciousness is a purely psychological term, right? Whereas in the Indian culture and in Buddhist cultures generally, it definitely does have something to do with rebirth. Yeah? And in modern Thai, for example, the word vinyan basically means ghost. Yeah? And the kind of the idioms, for example, you talk about apeta vijnana means someone whose consciousness is departed, yeah, so someone who's dead. Yeah? So these kinds of idioms, consciousness was definitely seen or understood in terms of rebirth. You know, even the different realms of rebirth were said to be vijnanatiti, as the stations of consciousness. Right? So consciousness is a flow, but it will become reasonably stable or reasonably established. Planted is the word. Patitita, we translate it as established, but actually literally means planted, like a plant is planted and grows. And so that's consciousness becomes established in the different realms. Yeah. So there's one passage where Sati, the fisherman's son, he says it's tadeva vijnanang ananyang. Yeah? It's that very same consciousness, not another, which gets reborn. Yeah? And so the Buddha was very critical of that. But he's not very critical. He doesn't say, no, it's nothing to do with vijnana, right? He says, no, haven't I told you that vijnana is conditioned? Yeah? In other words, it's not that it can't be a self-same vijnana. It's a conditioned process. And so that's what the process of dependent origination is talking about. Yeah? So vijnana is conditioned. So it's not the same, it's an evolving process. Yeah? And again, that's not a theory, that's an empirical reality. You know, it's not something which is, the whole point of it is not that there's this special entity of vijnana which is some kind of metaphysical reality, right? So this is the Brahmanical tendency in the Upanishads, that vijnana is then identified with the Atman, which is permanent. And so the Buddha is saying, well, you've started with something that's to do with experience, right, vijnana, but you've ended up with something that has nothing to do with your experience, which is permanence, because all of your experience actually is impermanent. Yeah? And so, but this is one of the things which actually comes from it's very easy for it to arise through meditation, and especially through a kind of an incomplete investigation in meditation. Like if you meditate, meditation goes deep, you have a deep samadhi experience, you experience radiance and awareness and bliss. And it's almost as if it can feel as if you've come in contact with a permanent world of bliss and light and consciousness. Right? Now, in fact, that experience is temporary. And even if you have a very profound meditation attainment, it only lasts for a period of time, and then it ends. Yeah? So the empirical reality is it's impermanent. Yeah? But you know how humans are, right? We love to make things more than what they are. So it's very easy to see that, have that experience, and you interpret that in terms of your background, right? So if you've been brought up to expect that Brahma is the creator of the universe, and that your Atman, your little soul, is the same as a cosmic Brahma, you say, well, that's it, I've seen Brahma. Yeah? If you're brought up in a Christian tradition, you say, I saw Jesus, or something like that. And so you interpret that through your own tradition, and that's a perfectly natural tendency. But this again is one of I think the great innovations that the Buddha brought in was to say, hang on, let's leave aside our assumptions about that experience and look at what is actually happening. And when you see what is actually happening, then you see, well, there are these factors which are present or absent, and this is, of course, the jhana formulas, and he talks about there are these factors present, and these feelings are present, or they're absent, and so on. And we can also see that experience as impermanent. It was there for a while, and then it stopped. And so then we're understanding that vijnana actually is an empirical phenomena which we can investigate, rather than being a metaphysical concept, which is a product of our philosophy. I find this tendency actually sort of creeps into Buddhism constantly. It's one of the major controversies in Buddhism for the last more than 1,500 years, actually. And it's very live. For example, in Thailand, they had this sort of controversy about what they call the original mind. Is Buddhism about trying to realize some kind of original mind, whatever that means, right? I mean, Ajahn Chah had a great analogy for the original mind. They asked him about this once, and it was a very interesting discussion, because one monk asked him about them, and I know who this monk is, and he's a monk who was very persistent. And it was very difficult. He wouldn't let go of a particular point once he started asking about it. So he asked Ajahn Chah about this original mind, and Ajahn Chah's response was to say, what are you talking about? So Ajahn Chah didn't want to talk about it, right? But this monk kept on insisting. He said, original mind. He said, well, you got to call it something, but, you otherwise you just sit there and grunt at each other. He said, but, let's say if I look at this cup, I've now removed that cup from that spot. So I call that spot the original spot. Yeah, I've got to call it something, otherwise we don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, but there's nothing there. Yeah, and then he was very emphatic on that point. He said it's ceased, it's finished, it's gone, it's not there anymore. Yeah, but we've got to call it something, so you can call it the original mind. Yeah, but that's how he uses it, but it's not necessarily how other people use that. It's one of these terms which is very elastic, gets used in different ways. Modern Taiwan as well, this has also become an issue of controversy within the community there. There are different interpretations of this kind of idea of the alaya vijnana, and is this the sort of storehouse consciousness, is this a provisional teaching that's talking about how this process of rebirth happens and so on, or is it some kind of ultimate teaching that's talking about the nature of nibbana? And this is something which has been controversial in the last quite a while in Chinese Buddhism, but especially in the last number of decades in Taiwanese Buddhism. Yeah. So there's always, I find there's always this tendency to you always want to hold on to something, and that is the last thing and the most subtle thing and the most appealing thing to hold on to. Yeah, in one of his talks, Ajahn Mahabua describes it as the most beautiful Miss Universe in the world. Yeah, if you want to hold on to it, but you realise it's just ignorance. Mm. I mean, if we want to look at consciousness in the context of rebirth and how it works, then you start by looking at consciousness in your own mind, right? How is this process always changing? Now, when we talk about consciousness being conditioned, right, it's easy enough to investigate that and to see that in your own mind, right? So you can see that, well, if you do certain kinds of things, your consciousness becomes in a certain way, right? Let's say you have a big, heavy meal, and then your consciousness becomes sleepy afterwards, yeah? You have a cup of coffee, your consciousness brightens up, yeah? You do some meditation, again, your consciousness clears. Yeah, our consciousness changes radically when we go to sleep, right? It's a completely different kind of consciousness. And then when you wake up, during the day, consciousness changes, right? But we're not really aware. Unless we take the time to reflect and be mindful, we're not aware of how that happens. But it is happening all the time. So we see consciousness being conditioned. And it's not just conditioned by external things that are happening to us, but even more importantly, it's being conditioned by our own choices, yeah? What we choose to do. And you know that your mind changes drastically if you make wise decisions or if you make foolish decisions, right? And you make bad decisions, or you get angry, or you do something nasty or something like that, and then it consumes your mind, yeah? And there's guilt, and there's remorse, and there's upset, and there's all these kinds of things. And if you go down that way, it makes it worse and worse and worse. On the other hand, if you follow the path of doing good, then your consciousness becomes bright and clear. You become happy, all the worries drop away, and so on and so forth. This is you're conditioning your consciousness according to your choices. And this is essentially what it's talking about with this sankhara paccaya vijnana, right? The activities of your choices condition your awareness. And so the point here is that that same process which we observe empirically here and now also applies to when we get reborn, right? Now, the most I think potent image that the Buddha used to talk about that process was vijnanam bijam. Consciousness is a seed. Yeah? This I think is very, very important. Consciousness is a seed. Right? So think about what a seed is. Right? You have a plant. Right? Grows up. Creates a seed. Now in that seed we understand it today as being a code. Right? A DNA code. Yeah? 4 base pairs. Right? Combined in different ways in a double helix. And in that code is the blueprint for creating a new plant. Right? So that whole plant goes. All that's left is the seed. Again, this use of the seed in this way is taken from Upanishadic imagery as well. Yeah, a beautiful image in the Upanishads. It talks about the teacher wanting to reveal the highest teaching to the student. Right? And so in that tradition, there's always there's kind of layers to the teaching. You have the esoteric teaching, and then as you go further inwards, the higher truths are revealed. So he gets the seed and he peels off the outer layer of the seed and says, "What do you see?" And then he goes inwards in all the different layers of the seed. Finally gets to the kernel of the seed, and then he cracks it open and says, "What's inside there?" He says, "I can't see anything." He says, yeah, that's that's the real truth. Yeah. So in the notion of consciousness as the seed, right? Everything has gone. Right? You imagine a big tree, all the root systems, the trunk, the leaves, all the beings that are living on it, all of that is gone. And all that's left is the seed. In fact, all that matters in the seed, really, is the DNA. Yeah? Tiny, tiny speck. And yet from that, a whole new tree can come, just as rich and just as complex as the one before. How that comes, again, is conditioned on moisture and weather and soil and all of those other things, right? So the DNA doesn't determine anything. And this is something which I think we've often misunderstood, even in modern science. People think that DNA determines something. I think modern biology has moved more and more away from that idea and more has emphasized the fact that DNA actually only works interdependently with the whole context and environment, yeah? So consciousness is the seed. So what is that seed? Well, that seed, the DNA ultimately is a code which carries information, right? And we know from the way that we use modern technology that information is not dependent on any particular physical medium. Okay? We can take the same information, we can put it in a book, we can put it in a computer file, we can spray paint it on a wall, we can talk about it, we can put it on radio waves and so on, and it'll be the same information. Right? So the actual physical medium doesn't matter. What matters is the pattern. Yeah? So we recognize those patterns which we have in language. Yeah? And so those patterns make a code, and because we understand the language, we can all break that code. Yeah? So this is how consciousness works. Yeah? Consciousness is a code. Yeah? It's information which is coded. What's the information? Memories, karma, intentions, character traits, all of those things. is wrapped up there. But just like the DNA, right, has the code, but that can't work by itself, right? I mean, in theory, the information is in the DNA, but in fact, it can't work without all of the proteins and the RNA and all of the other things, and it can't work without the nutriments and stuff that's in the seed, and it can't work without the moisture and all of those things. And that's all the Namarupa, right? That's all the other stuff which helps that consciousness to survive and helps it to grow and flourish. Yeah? And so this imagery of the seed and the growing is found all the way through, constantly, through the discussions of Vijnana and Namarupa. Yeah? Namarupa is patikitang woodhing virulhing, yeah? is planted, it grows and develops. Yeah? So this is like this seed of consciousness which grows up with all of these other things. Consciousness ceases all the time, but it ceases and renews, right? So it's ceasing in that process, yeah. But this again is one of the reasons given in the suttas for practicing meditation, especially deep meditation in jhanas and things like that, because you're seeing the gradual cessation of consciousness. Yeah, when you go into first jhana. No sight, sound, smell, taste and touch. Right? 5 consciousnesses gone. Right? Only mind consciousness. Right? And that mind consciousness also has there's no awareness of the past and the future, so they're all gone. Right? There's no thinking about different kinds of things. Right? That's all gone. Right? It's just mind consciousness of one thing, and that's kind of the radiance of the mind freed from the 5 hindrances. And so that's a huge amount of different kinds of consciousness which have already ended. And that's why the first jhana is so blissful. Right? The bliss of the first jhana is precisely the liberation of the mind from the burden of knowing all those different kinds of things. Yeah? And as you go through the different jhanas, you let go of coarser kinds of feelings and so on and so forth. The deeper you go into the jhanas, the more you're letting go of, the more things are ceasing, yeah? And the more blissful it is. Yeah? Of course, one of the higher formless attainments is the realm of infinite consciousness, right? Vijnanachayatana, which is what happens when all of those limits to consciousness, right, have ceased. Right? All the rupa and all of the things you're aware of, you're only aware of infinite consciousness itself. Yeah? I mean, so this is one of the most profound experiences that it's possible to have, and yet even that is impermanent, yeah? And even that's just what's next. Yeah? So this again is the power of the Buddha, that he was able to go to these experiences which everybody else would get into these experiences and say, that's just so incredible, right? And they say, well, that's it, I've found the answer. And he used to say, no, it's not enough. Yeah? Yeah. So thanks very much, everyone, for this, again, very interesting and stimulating discussion on vijnana, consciousness, and just some of the aspects. It's a very, very profound topic and very important topic, both in the Dhamma but also in our lives and our personal practice. So we certainly have not exhausted the topic, but we have run out of time. So unfortunately, I don't think our consciousness has ceased during this, but our time has ceased. So thank you for your participation and for your input, and I'll look forward to seeing you again for our next session. And to all the people who are watching this session, thanks for watching this last Dhamma threads discussing vijnana, and we look forward to seeing you again for our next session.